we're gonna go over the fastest and easiest, most effective ways that you guys can make an off-season resistance-based training program, and we're gonna start right now. So when we're looking at off-season training, there's a couple big factors, and I got my pen, I got my trusty planner right here. I like to take a lot of notes, and I like to look at a couple very, very key factors. And if we're looking at athletes in general, what is the sport? And if we have somebody who plays two sports, you've got to pick a priority. And I can do a whole nother video on how to do that later on, but I like to look at, okay, what is the specific sport? So let's go through a theoretical example. Okay, so I'm in the off season. So the first thing that I have to do is identify the sport. What sport am I picking? Let's say wrestling. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do, okay, when I identify, now we have wrestling. What type of sport is wrestling? What I like to do is use our Garage Strength program design book. This is how we laid out everything inside of Peak Strength, okay? So when you guys download Peak Strength, our strength training app, we actually develop the software based off of this formula. So the next thing that we do is we say, okay, wrestling is the sport. The next step is its type, and its type is a combat sport. Okay, so now when we're looking at a combat sport, that helps us mine down just a little bit deeper. Okay, now we can start to lump this together. We can look at the sport specificity, and then we can see, all right, what's another combat sport? Judo. What's another one? Jiu-jitsu. What's another one? Boxing. What's another one? MMA. What's another one? Kickboxing, Muay Thai, whatever. Starting with number one, identify the actual sport. Number two, identify the type of sport. Okay, so now we mine down deep, and now we're gonna start to pull out, and we're gonna start to see things a little bit clearer. So after we do that, we identify those strength characteristics. And what I like to do is identify, okay, if we've got strength characteristics, what are the top three that we're looking at? And this is something that I do with South Dakota State's wrestling program. I'm their strength coach. So they hired me over the last 2 years to build out their program. And we've laid this out over the last 2 years to the point where they're a Big 12 wrestling program. They're a mid-major school, and they just beat Michigan, who was number 6 in the country. Number 6 in the country. They just beat Michigan in wrestling. And this is a lot of the reasons why are around what we're doing with strength and conditioning. Their wrestling coaches are phenomenal. Coach Caldwell, Coach Hahn, absolutely amazing. So when we're looking at this, after we look at the strength characteristics, we have to identify, okay, what are the top 3 most important characteristics? Now, here's where it gets interesting. What we can do then is when you're looking at the top 3 characteristics, you can almost make a little bit of a decision tree, okay? Because the next aspect is you can lay out wrestling, and we could say that you have to have max strength. Okay, you've got to have a lot of absolute strength. You got to have a good back squat. You got to have a good bench press. You got to be good at pull-ups. So these things are key. So you have to have that absolute strength. You also have to have sustained endurance. Okay, so you've got to be able to do scrambles and recover from a scramble inside of an actual match. So that's a second strength characteristic. You've got to have blast impulse. You've got to be really, really explosive. Think about David Taylor hitting a crazy double leg or snapping somebody down, right? Like, you've got to be really, really explosive. You also have to have sustained impulse. So the sustained impulse might be like 10 to 12 seconds of being explosive. So now we're looking at 4 strength characteristics. Then you have to look at, okay, well, classical endurance, that's part of it. Classical endurance, if you're a wrestler and you're wrestling for 7 minutes, you've got to have that endurance. Now, this is where we can clarify things. So we just named 5 characteristics. Typically, what I like to do is the next step would say, let's take a specific athlete, or we take all of the athletes that we're training. In this case, the scenario that we're providing is wrestling, but you can apply this to swimming. You can apply this to badminton. You can apply this to judo. You can apply this to soccer. You can apply this to highlight. It doesn't matter, right? So the next thing then is we've got to test. Okay, so we have to test these athletes. This is what we do inside Peak Strength. We're going to go in and we want to see, what are your results? What's your best results that you have that you can and then inform our software so that we can build the best off-season program for you based off of what your needs are. And it's going to be compared to benchmarks. That's the next one. Okay, so we have benchmarks that we have set, and those benchmarks are going to be based off of historical success of like-minded or like physical bodies. So if we look at wrestling and we said, okay, to get to the Division I level or to be a state medalist at the high school level or to just start varsity, these are the benchmarks that we have for specific movements. We've got, we can look at a power clean, we can look at a bench press, we can look at pull-ups, we can look at a 5-minute assault bike test, we can look at 10-second RPM development on an assault bike, we can look at all these different things. What's your 5K time for that classical endurance? And then when we analyze those benchmarks, we have to go back and compare the tests of the individual to the benchmarks. We take the benchmarks, we compare the tests of the individual to the benchmarks, and then we pick 3 strength characteristics. So we could look at this and say, this wrestler's clean, power clean, is very, very weak. And this is actually a very, very good example. So if we take, in the case of South Dakota State, I'm gonna give you an example that you guys could fact check me on. Clay Carlson wrestles at South Dakota State. And when we went through testing and discussing how to improve him as a wrestler, some of the key factors was he's got great endurance. He's a little uncoordinated. He's a little slow. He's not that strong. So some of the things that we had to focus on was his blast impulse. Then we have to look at what are the key movements that impact blast impulse. What plyometrics, what weightlifting derivatives, what strength movements. Then we have to look at, okay, so he's not that stable either as an individual. He's got great endurance, he's got a great engine, but we need to then improve his absolute strength. And the absolute strength feeds into his blast impulse. Blast impulse. So now we've got 2 strength characteristics that we know we have to improve, blast impulse and absolute strength. And then finally, we're going full in on the fact that we have to develop him to be a freakier athlete. We've got to get him to be more explosive. That's the main goal. So that takes us into sustained impulse. We need him to be able to get into crazy positions fast, be able to handle those fast positions and be strong in those positions, okay? So we need to improve his rate of coordination, his rate of force development, his impulse expression, which is force over a period of time. That's gonna help him in scrambles. That's gonna help him apply force faster. And we know that genetically, he's much more gifted endurance-wise. So we're gonna make sure that he continues to do that endurance work, but we're really going to be focusing on those 3 characteristics that are his weakness. Okay, what ends up happening with Clay? He goes on, he becomes a Division I All-American, gets 5th last year at NCAA championships. And he's still in this season working through the year. So now we can work backwards and we can just say, okay, focus on testing, okay? And if we work backwards, we have those tests, we compare the tests to the benchmarks, we then compare those benchmarks, those are established based off of the type of sport. So based off the type of sport establishes the strength characteristics needed. And then finally, we can mine back to the exact sport. So that's how we like to build out that specific off-season program. And then that basically educates us, okay, if this is the top-down view, now we've got to mine deeper, and then we can look at what movements are we going to do on a leg power day? What movements are we going to do on an upper body power day? What movements do we need to focus on an athlete day? How weak was Clay when he would do a single leg jump versus a bilateral jump? How weak was Clay when we would do a counter movement versus not having a counter movement? So all of these things play into discussing and analyzing and building out that strength training program that you guys can have access to in your pocket. All you have to do is head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. You can download Peak Strength today. You're gonna get 7 free days of training, and Peak Strength is gonna lay out the best off-season workout for you to become a freak. Because remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you've always gotta cultivate your power. Peace.